The classroom buzzed with the familiar sounds of pencils scratching paper, chairs creaking, and quiet murmurs as the students worked on their assignments. The teacher moved between the rows of desks, offering encouragement and occasional reminders to stay focused. It was an ordinary day, or at least it had started that way. In the back corner of the room, one of the quieter boys sat hunched over his desk. He was small for his age, often overlooked by his peers, but he had a knack for drawing that caught the attention of anyone who happened to see his work. His talent wasn't just impressive, it was extraordinary. The way he captured detail and emotion was far beyond what one would expect from a child. Today, however, his drawings seemed different. The assignment was simple: draw something that made you feel happy or safe. Most of the kids had already finished their pictures, proudly presenting colorful scenes of family picnics, pets, or favorite cartoon characters. But this boy's paper remained blank for the longest time. When he finally started drawing, his focus became almost unnerving. His pencil moved with a precision that belied his young age. The teacher noticed the change first. From her desk, she could see the intensity in his movements, the way he pressed the pencil hard enough to leave indents on the sheet beneath. She walked over, curious to see what had him so engrossed, but as she approached, the boy hunched over his work, shielding it from view. "Are you doing okay?" she asked gently, trying not to startle him. He nodded without looking up, muttering something she couldn't quite catch. Deciding to give him space, she moved on, but an uneasy feeling settled in her chest. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, the students gathered their things and handed in their work. The boy hesitated, clutching his paper tightly. Finally, as the other students filed out, he walked up to the teacher's desk and placed his drawing on top of the pile without a word. Then, he hurried out the door. The teacher sat down, sorting through the drawings with a faint smile. Most were exactly what she'd expected: cheerful and imaginative creations from young minds. But when she reached his drawing, her smile vanished. Her hand froze mid-air, the paper trembling slightly between her fingers. The image was unlike anything she had ever seen a child create. It wasn't just the detail, it was the subject. A sprawling landscape covered in shadows and chaos. Figures were scattered throughout, twisted in pain or fear. In the center stood a tall, featureless figure, its elongated arms reaching out as if to pull everything into itself. Around its feet, strange symbols were drawn, etched with such precision they seemed almost intentional, as though they held a meaning she couldn't understand. The longer she stared at the drawing, the more unsettled she became. It felt wrong, not just for its content, but for how vividly it seemed to pulse with emotion. The scene looked alive, as if it might crawl off the page at any moment. The teacher turned pale, her hands gripping the desk to steady herself. It wasn't just the drawing that disturbed her, it was the symbols. They looked familiar. Her mind raced, searching for where she'd seen them before. Then it hit her, like a cold shock running down her spine. She had seen those symbols before, years ago, in a news report about an unsolved case that had haunted her for weeks. The details were blurry now, but she remembered enough to know that those symbols were no random creation. They had been found etched into the walls of a crime scene, one that had never been explained. Heart pounding, she glanced around the empty classroom, her instincts screaming at her to act. She grabbed her phone and snapped a picture of the drawing before carefully sliding the paper into a folder. She needed to talk to someone who could make sense of this. But there was no way she could just brush this off as an overactive imagination. There was something here, something deeply unsettling. The police station was only a few blocks away, but even that short walk felt endless. The air felt heavier with every step, the folder under her arm a tangible weight of dread. When she arrived, she hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. At the front desk, she handed the folder to an officer, explaining in as much detail as she could manage. The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, but opened the folder anyway. His expression changed almost immediately. He stared at the drawing for what felt like an eternity before looking up. Where did this come from? He asked, his tone sharper now. One of my students, the teacher replied. He turned it in today. I thought it was just a strange drawing at first, but those symbols. I've seen them before. On the news years ago. The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he stood and disappeared into the back, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the faint hum of the station doing little to calm her nerves. When the officer returned, he wasn't alone. A detective followed, his face set in a grim expression. He introduced himself briefly, then motioned for her to follow him into a quieter room. Once they were seated, he placed the drawing on the table between them. Tell me everything you know about the boy who drew this, he said. The teacher hesitated. He's quiet, keeps to himself mostly. He's incredibly talented, but this isn't like him. I don't know where he would have seen anything like this. The detective leaned back, studying her carefully. You said you recognized the symbols? Are you sure about that? She nodded. I can't remember all the details, but they were connected to something horrible. A case that was never solved. The detective exhaled slowly, his eyes drifting back to the drawing. You're right about one thing. These symbols aren't random. And if this boy knows about them, we need to figure out how. A cold chill ran through her as his words sank in. Do you think he's in danger? She asked. I don't know, the detective admitted. But we're going to find out. Back at the school, the boy sat in the corner of the playground, watching the other kids with a faraway look in his eyes. He seemed oblivious to the world around him, his mind elsewhere. When a shadow fell across him, he looked up to see the teacher standing there, her expression unreadable. Can I talk to you for a minute? She asked softly. He nodded, following her inside. They walked in silence to the art room, where she closed the door behind them. I saw your drawing, she began, choosing her words carefully. It's very detailed. Can you tell me what inspired it? The boy fidgeted, his gaze fixed on the floor. I don't know, he mumbled. It just came to me. Did you see those symbols somewhere before? She pressed gently. His eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite place, fear, maybe, or confusion. No, he said quickly. I just drew them. The teacher didn't believe him, not entirely, but she didn't want to push too hard. It's a very powerful drawing, she said finally. But if you ever feel scared or need to talk, you can always come to me, okay? He nodded again, but his silence only deepened her unease. When she returned to her desk, her phone buzzed with a message from the detective, we need to meet. There's more to this than we thought. Her heart sank as she stared at the words, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She didn't know where this was leading, but one thing was certain: this was only the beginning. The detective's message lingered in the teacher's mind for the rest of the day, casting a shadow over everything she did. She couldn't stop thinking about the boy's drawing and the symbols etched into it. How could a child create something like that, so precise, so haunting, without having seen it somewhere before? And if he had seen it, where could he have encountered something so dark and disturbing? She wanted answers, but she also felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He was her student, after all. A child. Whatever was happening, she had to protect him. The thought of involving him in something bigger than he could understand felt wrong, but there was no denying that something unusual was unfolding, something that might already be beyond her control. Later that evening, she met the detective at a quiet diner. The place was nearly empty, giving them privacy to talk. He had brought the drawing, now encased in a clear protective sleeve, and laid it carefully on the table between them. We ran this through our system, the detective began without preamble. The symbols match several cases we've been looking into, but here's the thing: they weren't released to the public. No one outside the investigations should know about them. The teacher felt her stomach tighten. So, how could he have drawn them? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. That's what we're trying to figure out, he replied, leaning forward. You said he's a quiet kid. Has he ever talked about anything unusual? Family, friends, places he's been? She shook her head. No. He's always been reserved, but I never thought it was anything out of the ordinary. He's talented, yes, but this isn't normal. The detective nodded, his expression grim. We need to talk to him, and his parents. If there's something going on at home, we need to know. The thought of involving the boy's parents made her uneasy, but she knew it was necessary. The detective promised to handle it delicately, assuring her that their priority was the boy's safety. Still, as she left the diner that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into something far more complicated than either of them realized. The next day, the detective showed up at the school with another officer, both of them in plain clothes to avoid drawing attention. They waited in the principal's office while the teacher went to find the boy. He was sitting alone again, this time at the edge of the playground, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. When she approached, he looked up, his eyes cautious but not surprised. There's someone here who wants to talk to you, she said gently. It's nothing to be scared of. They just want to ask a few questions about your drawing. He hesitated, his small hands tightening around the stick. For a moment, she thought he might refuse, but then he nodded and stood, following her silently to the office. Inside, the detective greeted him warmly, trying to put him at ease. The boy sat across from him, his posture stiff, his eyes darting between the adults in the room. The teacher stayed by his side, offering silent reassurance. You're a very talented artist, the detective began, holding up a copy of the drawing. This is really impressive. Can you tell me about it? What made you want to draw this? The boy shrugged, his gaze dropping to the floor. I don't know, he said quietly. It just came to me. Did you see these symbols somewhere before? The detective pressed. Maybe in a book or on TV? The boy shook his head. No. They were just in my head. The detective exchanged a glance with the teacher, his expression unreadable. Sometimes, he said, softening his tone, our minds pick up things without us realizing it. Do you ever have dreams about these symbols? Or about anything like this? The boy didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. Sometimes. But they're not like normal dreams. They feel real. What happens in these dreams? The detective asked, leaning in slightly. The boy hesitated, his small fingers fidgeting with the edge of his shirt. There's a place. It's dark, and there's a sound like buzzing, but inside my head. And the tall man is there, always watching. The room fell silent. The detective scribbled something in his notebook, but his movements were slow, deliberate. The teacher's heart ached for the boy. He looked so small, so fragile, sitting there under the weight of questions he shouldn't have to answer. Thank you for telling me, the detective said finally. You're very brave. The boy didn't respond. He just sat there, staring at the floor, as if he wanted nothing more than to disappear. After the boy was escorted back to class, the detective turned to the teacher and the principal. This is bigger than I thought, he admitted. We need to look into his background, family history, places they've lived. Something isn't adding up here. The teacher nodded, though her unease grew with every passing moment. She trusted the detective, but the idea of digging into the boy's personal life felt invasive. Still, if it could help protect him, she would do whatever was necessary. That afternoon, the detective visited the boy's home. The house was modest, tucked away on a quiet street. His mother greeted them at the door, her expression wary but polite. She listened carefully as the detective explained the situation, her face growing paler with every word. I don't understand, she said, her voice trembling. He's just a child. He doesn't know anything about symbols or crimes. Has he ever talked about having unusual dreams? The detective asked. The mother hesitated, her hands twisting nervously. He has nightmares sometimes, she admitted. But he's never said much about them. Just that they scare him. Do you know where he might have seen these symbols? He pressed. She shook her head. No. We don't watch anything violent, and I don't let him use the internet without supervision. He's a good boy. Quiet but good. The detective nodded, jotting down notes. Has anything unusual happened recently? Any strange visitors, or incidents that seemed out of the ordinary? The mother's brow furrowed in thought. No, not that I can think of. We keep to ourselves mostly. As the conversation continued, the detective couldn't shake the feeling that something was being left unsaid. The mother's answers were straightforward, but there was a tension in her posture, a flicker of fear in her eyes that hinted at more. Back at the station, the detective reviewed the case files connected to the symbols. Each one was tied to a different location, a different tragedy, but the similarities were undeniable. The symbols appeared at every scene, always carved with meticulous precision. And now, a child had drawn them from memory or from somewhere deeper. He couldn't shake the boy's description of the tall man. It matched accounts from some of the older cases, witnesses who had reported seeing a similar figure before disappearing without a trace. It was a lead, but it raised more questions than answers. As night fell, the teacher found herself unable to sleep. She kept replaying the boy's words in her mind, trying to make sense of them. The idea that his dreams could be connected to something real was almost too much to comprehend, but the evidence was hard to ignore. The boy, too, lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The images from his dreams lingered at the edges of his mind, vivid and unrelenting. He didn't understand why they came to him or what they meant, but he knew one thing for certain: they weren't just dreams. Somewhere, in the shadows of the quiet town, the tall man waited. The next few days at school felt heavy, as though an unseen weight hung in the air. The teacher couldn't help but notice subtle changes in the boy. He seemed quieter than usual, if that were even possible, and he rarely made eye contact anymore. She watched him from across the classroom, her concern growing with each passing day. It wasn't just his behavior, it was the way other children were avoiding him, as if they could sense something was different about him, something they couldn't explain. The detective, too, was feeling the strain of the case. Each lead they chased brought them closer to something, but the picture remained incomplete. He spent hours poring over files, cross-referencing details, and trying to piece together how a boy could know so much about things he shouldn't. The tall man loomed in his thoughts like a shadow he couldn't escape. Witness accounts, sketchy as they were, all described the same figure, towering, faceless, and always just out of reach. It was enough to make even a seasoned officer uneasy. One evening, the boy's mother called. The teacher in a panic. Her voice trembled over the phone as she described something strange that had happened. She had gone to check on her son in the middle of the night, and found him sitting upright in bed, staring blankly at the wall. His eyes were open, but he didn't seem to be awake. When she gently shook him, he snapped out of it, confused and disoriented, with no memory of why he had been sitting there. He said it was a dream, the mother explained, her voice breaking. But it wasn't just a dream. There's something wrong. I can feel it. The teacher assured her that she would speak to the detective and urged her to keep a close eye on him. But as she hung up the phone, a chill ran through her. She couldn't ignore the growing sense that they were all being drawn into something far beyond their understanding. The following morning, the boy didn't come to school. His absence was noted by the teacher and the detective, who had been planning to follow up with more questions. When the teacher called his home, there was no answer. Alarmed, she contacted the detective, and within an hour they were on their way to the boy's house. When they arrived, the front door was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. The detective's hand instinctively went to his sidearm as he stepped inside, calling out for the boy and his mother. The house was eerily quiet, every sound amplified by the tension in the air. The teacher stayed close behind him, her heart pounding in her chest. The living room was undisturbed, as was the kitchen. But when they reached the boy's room, the detective stopped short. The walls were covered in drawings, dozens of them, all depicting the same symbols and dark figures. Some were faint, as though drawn hurriedly, while others were etched with careful precision. In the center of the room was the boy's sketchbook, open to a page that showed the tall man, more detailed than ever before. "He's not here," the detective said grimly, scanning the room. "We need to find them. Now." They called for backup, and within minutes, officers were canvassing the neighborhood. The teacher, unable to sit idly by, joined the search, her mind racing with questions. Where could they have gone? And why would they leave without telling anyone? As night fell, the search grew more desperate. The teacher wandered the nearby park, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. It was quiet, almost unnaturally so, and every rustle of leaves made her jump. She called out the boy's name, her voice echoing through the empty space. Then she saw a faint light flickering in the distance. It came from a small clearing at the edge of the park, where an old gazebo stood. She approached cautiously, her pulse quickening. The light was coming from a lantern, and beneath it sat the boy, his knees drawn to his chest. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling with relief. She knelt beside him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. He looked up at her, his face pale and his eyes glassy. "He's here," he whispered. "He's watching." A chill ran down her spine. "Who's watching?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. The boy pointed toward the trees, where the shadows seemed to twist and shift unnaturally. For a moment, she thought she saw something move tall and thin, blending seamlessly with the darkness. She grabbed the boy's hand and pulled him to his feet. "We have to go," she said urgently. But before they could take a step, the light from the lantern flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. The teacher's heart raced as she fumbled for her phone, trying to illuminate their path. The boy clung to her, his small hands trembling. In the distance, she heard voices, officers calling out as they continued the search. She screamed for help, her voice breaking through the silence. The shadows seemed to close in around them, and she felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, as though a pair of unseen eyes were fixed on her every move. When the flashlight beam finally broke through the darkness, she nearly collapsed with relief. The detective appeared, his expression one of both confusion and concern. He led them back to safety, though the teacher couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had been watching them the entire time. Back at the station, the boy sat quietly in a chair, his hands folded in his lap. He didn't speak, even when his mother arrived, frantic and tearful. The teacher stayed close, unwilling to leave him alone. The detective worked tirelessly, trying to piece together what had happened, but the boy offered no answers. As the hours dragged on, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. The boy's gaze kept drifting to the window, his expression unreadable. The teacher followed his line of sight but saw nothing, just the darkness of the night beyond the glass. But the boy saw something. The boy's eyes were fixed on the window, unblinking, as though he were waiting for something or someone. His mother's voice broke through the tense silence as she pleaded for him to speak, to tell her what was wrong. He remained silent, his small frame rigid and unyielding. The detective exchanged a concerned glance with the teacher. Something about the boy's behavior was deeply unsettling, as though he were tuned into a frequency none of them could hear. Then the boy suddenly stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Everyone in the room froze. He walked slowly toward the window, his movements deliberate and strange, as though he were being pulled by an invisible thread. His mother called his name, but he didn't respond. The detective moved to intercept him, gently placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. The boy stopped but didn't look at him. Instead, he turned his head slightly, just enough to speak in a low, almost mechanical tone. He's here. The words sent a chill through everyone in the room. The teacher instinctively stepped closer to the boy, her protective instincts kicking in. Who's here? She asked, her voice shaking despite her effort to stay calm. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward the window. The detective hesitated before drawing back the curtain, revealing nothing but the still night outside. For a moment, everyone exhaled, convinced it was just another eerie moment in a series of unsettling events. But then the boy spoke again, his voice eerily calm. You can't see him yet. He doesn't want you to. The detective's jaw tightened as he pulled the curtain shut again, his unease growing. He crouched down to meet the boy's gaze, speaking gently but firmly. Tell me what's going on. Who are you talking about? The boy's eyes, usually full of curiosity and wonder, were now distant and cold. He wants me to go with him, he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. The boy's mother rushed to his side, gripping his shoulders. No, you're staying here, she said, her voice cracking with fear. You're not going anywhere. The boy finally looked at her, his expression softening for the briefest moment. It's not up to me, he whispered. The lights flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness before the bulbs buzzed back to life. The detective's hand instinctively went to his holster as he scanned the room, his heart pounding. The teacher grabbed the boy's hand, pulling him close. Stay with me, she said, her voice trembling. You're safe here. But the boy shook his head. It's too late. Before anyone could respond, a sudden, deafening noise erupted outside, a high-pitched, almost mechanical screech that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. The sound was unlike anything they had ever heard, and it was growing louder. The detective rushed to the door, throwing it open and stepping outside, his weapon drawn. The street was empty, but the sound persisted, echoing off the buildings and filling the air with an almost unbearable tension. The teacher stayed behind with the boy and his mother, her eyes darting toward the windows. We need to get out of here, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But before they could move, the boy broke free from her grasp and walked to the center of the room. His posture was unnervingly calm, his small frame seemingly unaffected by the chaos unfolding around them. He's coming inside, the boy said softly. The mother screamed for the detective, who came rushing back into the room just as the front door slammed shut behind him, the lock turning on its own. He tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The sound outside grew louder, closer, as if it were pressing against the walls. The teacher grabbed the boy again, shaking him gently. Tell us how to stop this. Please, she begged. But the boy didn't answer. Instead, his gaze shifted toward the far corner of the room. Slowly, they all turned to look. At first, there was nothing. Just shadows pooling unnaturally in the corner, darker than they had any right to be. But then the shadows moved, twisting and stretching upward until they formed a vague, towering silhouette. The air in the room grew colder, heavy with an unexplainable pressure. The figure was there, unmistakably present, though it seemed to flicker in and out of sight, as if the very act of perceiving it was an affront to reality. The detective raised his weapon, his hand shaking. Stay back, he shouted, though his voice faltered under the weight of his own fear. The boy stepped forward, his expression blank. You can't stop him, he said, his voice distant. He's not from here. The words hung in the air, their implications sending a fresh wave of terror through everyone in the room. The teacher pulled the boy back, her grip firm but trembling. We're not letting you go with him, she said, her voice resolute despite her fear. The figure didn't move, but its presence seemed to grow stronger, more oppressive. The shadows around it writhed like living things, and the sound outside began to change, morphing into a low, guttural hum that seemed to resonate within their very bones. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the ragged breaths of the people inside. The figure in the corner remained, its form solidifying ever so slightly, though its features were still obscured by the darkness. The detective lowered his weapon slightly, his mind racing. "What does he want?" he demanded, his voice strained. The boy looked up at him, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He wants me to come with him," he said. "And if I don't, he'll take someone else." The weight of those words settled heavily on the room. The boy's mother clung to him, sobbing uncontrollably, while the teacher and the detective exchanged a look of helplessness. The stakes had never been higher, and the choices before them were unthinkable. The figure took a single, deliberate step forward, its presence filling the room with an almost unbearable sense of dread. The boy looked back at the teacher, his expression unreadable. "You can't stop him," he said again, his voice barely audible. But the teacher refused to believe that. She tightened her grip on the boy's hand, her eyes blazing with determination. "We'll find a way," she said. "We won't let him take you. Not you, not anyone." The figure paused, as if considering her words. Then the lights flickered again, plunging them back into darkness. This time, the darkness felt alive, suffocating, as though it were wrapping itself around them. The boy's voice broke through the void, steady and calm. "He's waiting for you to decide." The room was shrouded in darkness, an oppressive void that seemed to swallow every sound and breath. The teacher tightened her hold on the boy, her knuckles white as she refused to let him slip away. The detective fumbled with his flashlight, his trembling hands betraying the fear he tried to mask. The beam of light flickered to life, cutting through the suffocating blackness, but it seemed to do little against the oppressive presence that loomed in the corner. The figure moved again, slow and deliberate, as though it had all the time in the world. Its towering form seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, making it impossible to discern where it began or ended. "The detective!" shouted into the void, his voice a mix of desperation and anger. "Leave him alone! Whatever you are, whatever you want, take me instead." The words echoed in the room, lingering for a moment before they were met with silence. Then the air shifted. The oppressive weight lessened, replaced by a chilling stillness. The figure stopped moving, and the shadows around it seemed to recoil, as if they were retreating. For a brief moment, hope flickered in the teacher's chest. But then the boy spoke, his voice steady and unnervingly calm. "He doesn't want you," he said, looking up at the detective with eyes that seemed far older than his years. "He's not here for a trade. He's here for what belongs to him." The detective shook his head, refusing to accept it. "You don't belong to anyone," he said firmly, stepping closer to the boy and the teacher. "We're not letting this thing take you." The figure in the corner began to shift again, this time faster, more fluidly. Its form became less solid, as though it were melting into the shadows themselves. The air grew colder, and the hum from outside returned, vibrating through the walls. The boy's mother screamed, her voice breaking as she pleaded with the figure. "Take me! Just leave my son alone!" The figure seemed to pause, its formless head tilting slightly, as though it were considering her offer. The shadows stretched toward her, tendrils of darkness reaching out, but they stopped just short of touching her. The figure turned its attention back to the boy, who stood eerily still, his small frame unwavering. The teacher's heart raced as she clung to him, refusing to let go. "There has to be a way to stop this," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. She looked into the boy's eyes, searching for some sign, some clue. "You said it wants you because you're his," she said, her voice trembling. "What does that mean? What did you do?" The boy hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I didn't do anything," he said softly. "It's just always been there. Waiting." The detective's flashlight flickered again, and the beam landed on the drawing still sitting on the desk. He stepped toward it, picking it up carefully. The strange symbols, the ominous shapes, it all seemed to mean something, though none of them could understand it. "This picture," he said, turning back to the boy. "Did you see this somewhere?" Did someone show it to you? The boy shook his head. I didn't see it, he said. I dreamed it. And when I woke up, I just knew how to draw it. The teacher's breath caught in her throat. This thing in your dream, is it the same thing that's here now? The boy nodded, his expression unreadable. It's been waiting for me to remember. The words sent a shiver down her spine. The detective looked at the drawing again, his eyes narrowing as he studied it. Something about the patterns seemed almost alive, as though they were shifting slightly under the beam of light. What happens if it takes you? He asked, his voice low. The boy looked up at him, his face impossibly calm. It won't stop with me, he said. It'll keep going. The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. The teacher's grip on the boy tightened, and she glanced at the detective. We can't let that happen, she said. There has to be a way to fight it. The detective looked back at the figure, his jaw clenched. If this thing came for him because of the drawing, maybe it's tied to it somehow. If we destroy the picture before he could finish, the shadows surged forward, faster and more violently than before. The figure moved with them, its form solidifying as it reached toward the detective. He stumbled back, raising his weapon, but the figure stopped just short of him. Instead, it turned its attention to the boy, its focus unrelenting. The teacher felt the boy tense in her arms, and she whispered desperately to him. Tell me what to do. Please. The boy's lips parted, and for the first time, his voice wavered. I don't know if you can stop it. The figure loomed over them, its presence filling every corner of the room. The hum grew louder, the vibrations shaking the walls and floor. The detective gritted his teeth, raising his flashlight and aiming it directly at the figure. The beam seemed to pierce through the shadows, causing them to writhe and retreat slightly. The boy suddenly broke free from the teacher's grasp, stepping toward the figure. His mother screamed, reaching for him, but he turned to her, his expression soft. I can make it stop, he said. But I have to go with him. The teacher grabbed his arm, shaking her head. No. There has to be another way. The boy looked at her, his eyes filled with something that looked almost like gratitude. Thank you, he said quietly. For trying. Before anyone could stop him, the boy stepped into the shadows. The figure seemed to envelop him, its form twisting and folding around him until he was no longer visible. The room grew silent, the oppressive presence fading away. The lights flickered back to life, and the hum disappeared. The detective, the teacher, and the mother stood frozen, their breaths ragged as they stared at the now empty room. The boy was gone. The only thing left was the drawing, still lying on the desk. But as they looked closer, they realized something had changed. The symbols and shapes were gone, replaced by a single, childlike drawing of a family holding hands under a bright sun. The mother collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. The teacher wrapped her arms around her, tears streaming down her own face. The detective picked up the drawing, his hands shaking as he stared at it. He didn't understand what had happened, but one thing was clear: the boy had made a choice, and they would have to live with it. As they stood there, trying to make sense of it all, a faint, almost imperceptible hum began to echo in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The room felt eerily quiet after the figure vanished. The air, which had been thick with tension, now felt lighter, though it carried an unmistakable heaviness of loss. The teacher, still clutching the boy's mother, whispered soothing words, though she wasn't sure if they were meant for the grieving woman or herself. The detective stood motionless, staring at the strange, innocent drawing left behind. It felt surreal, like the remnants of a dream that hadn't quite faded upon waking. The mother's sobs softened, and she pulled back slightly, her red-rimmed eyes meeting the teacher's. He's gone, she whispered, her voice trembling. My baby is gone. The teacher shook her head, though she had no comforting words to offer. I don't think he's truly gone, she said softly. He did this to protect us, didn't he? The mother's face crumpled again, and the detective finally found his voice. "That's what it seems like," he said, though even he struggled to believe the words as they left his mouth. He knew more than any of us about whatever that was. And he made a choice. The hum, faint and distant, seemed to pulse once before dissipating completely. The teacher glanced at the drawing again, unease prickling her skin. "What do we do with this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The detective hesitated, then carefully folded the paper and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "We'll figure it out later," he said. "For now, let's get out of here." The group moved hesitantly toward the door, their movements slow and deliberate, as though any sudden action might bring the figure back. When they stepped into a hallway, the fluorescent lights above seemed too bright, too normal, given everything that had just happened. The school was silent, the earlier chaos replaced by an almost unnatural calm. The mother wiped her eyes and turned to the detective. "Will it come back?" she asked, her voice small and broken. He didn't have an answer, but he lied anyway. "No," he said firmly. "It's over." The teacher looked at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt, but she said nothing. Instead, she gently guided the mother toward the exit. Outside, the cold night air hit them like a wave, and for the first time in hours they felt like they could breathe again. The street was empty, the flashing lights of police cars long gone. It was as though the world had moved on, unaware of the unimaginable events that had unfolded inside the school. The detective stayed behind for a moment, staring at the building. He couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered in the shadows, watching, waiting. Shaking his head, he followed the others to the sidewalk. Over the next few days, the story of what happened at the school became a quiet mystery. Officials wrote it off as a gas leak causing hallucinations, though those who had been there knew better. The boy's disappearance was officially classified as unexplained, but whispers spread among those who had seen the drawing before the detective took it. The symbols, the figure, they became the stuff of urban legend. The teacher struggled to return to her normal routine. Every time she walked into the classroom, she expected to see the boy sitting at his desk, his quiet presence a constant reminder of what had been lost. She couldn't bring herself to erase the faint outline of his drawings still visible on the board. They felt like a tether to him, a reminder that he had been there, that he had mattered. The mother withdrew from the world, her grief too heavy to bear. The detective visited her often, offering what little comfort he could. He kept the folded drawing in a locked box in his desk, unable to bring himself to destroy it but too afraid to leave it unguarded. Late at night, he would take it out and study it, hoping to find answers in the seemingly innocuous lines and shapes. But the more he stared, the less he understood, and the more he felt the weight of the boy's sacrifice. Months passed, and life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The teacher found solace in her students, using their laughter and curiosity to fill the void left by the boy. The mother began volunteering at a local shelter, channeling her pain into helping others. And the detective, though haunted by the events of that night, continued his work, driven by a newfound determination to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. One evening, as the teacher was cleaning her classroom, she noticed something unusual. On the corner of the board, where the boy's faint drawings had once been, a new image had appeared. It was small and simple, a stick figure of a boy standing next to what looked like a swirling shadow. Above them was a bright sun, its rays stretching across the board. She stared at it for a long time, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know how it had gotten there or what it meant, but she felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. The mother, too, experienced something she couldn't explain. While sorting donations at the shelter, she found a small, handmade card tucked into one of the boxes. Inside was a simple message written in a child's handwriting: "Thank you for everything. I'm okay." Tears streamed down her face as she held the card to her chest, her heart aching but lighter than it had been in months. The detective, meanwhile, received an anonymous package at his office. Inside was a small, nondescript notebook. Flipping through it, He found pages filled with intricate drawings and symbols, similar to the ones the boy had created. But these symbols didn't instill the same dread as the original drawing. Instead, they seemed to pulse with an energy that felt warm, almost comforting. He couldn't explain it, but he knew they were a message, a sign that the boy's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. As time went on, the events of that night became a distant memory, buried beneath the routines of daily life. But for those who had been there, the boy's presence lingered. He had given them more than his protection, he had given them hope. In his own quiet, unassuming way, he had shown them the power of selflessness, the strength of a love that transcended fear. And though they would never forget the shadows or the figure that had haunted them, they chose to remember the light that had shone through the darkness, the light of a boy who had drawn more than a strange picture. He had drawn a path forward, one that they would carry with them for the rest of their lives.